Hello everyone, this is Vicky from NIPER. In this video, I will discuss an important topic from biopharmaceutics subject, that is protein binding of drugs. I'm discussing this from Brahmakar book, which is a standard book for biopharmaceutics. So normally, if you take any drug that enters your body, some part of your drug will bind to your plasma proteins or your tissue proteins. So that binded drug is pharmacodynamically and pharmacokinetically inactive. Let's say if you take 500 mg of drug, out of that 500 mg of drug, 100 mg will adsorb on the gut wall or adsorb to your food particles, and maybe 200 or 100 mg will metabolize it by CYP enzymes which are present in your stomach and from liver. So 300 mg is absorbed into your systemic circulation. So again, out of that 300 mg, some 100 mg of drug will bind to your plasma proteins or your tissue proteins. So that bounded drugs are pharmacodynamically and pharmacokinetically inactive. Only the free drug, the unbounded drugs, are only pharmacodynamically and pharmacokinetically active. Here, the phenomenon of complex formation of drugs with your proteins is called as your protein binding of drugs. Generally, this protein binding is of two types, that is intracellular binding and extracellular binding. Intracellular binding is your binding to your specific receptors. So if you the drug will bind to some specific receptor, then only it will show their therapeutic activity. So those specific receptors are your intracellular binding. Receptors which the drug interact to show response are called as your primary receptors, where the extracellular bindings are your plasma proteins, which do not usually show your pharmacological activity, and that's why they're called silent receptors or secondary receptors. So these are the two types of plasma protein bindings. So here the bounded drug is both pharmacodynamically and pharmacokinetically active, but the unbounded drug is only active where bounded drug, that is protein binded drug, is pharmacodynamically and pharmacokinetically inactive. So this question was asked in 2024 GPAT paper, and it is neither metabolized or excreted nor it is active pharmacologically. So when the drug is binded to your plasma proteins, when it is not excreted from your body, it will generate some toxic effects. Their shelf life or half life also increased. So that will cause your toxicity. So protein binding may leads to your toxicity. So these are some key points of protein bindings. So now we'll discuss some mechanisms of protein bindings. These protein bindings may be reversible or irreversible. Mostly it is reversible, but in rare cases it is irreversible. So out of these intracellular and extracellular bindings, the protein binding, plasma protein binding, that is your extracellular binding, is most common. That is binding of drugs to your blood components, that is your plasma protein binding. So the most abundant plasma proteins in our body are your albumin, glycoprotein, lipoproteins, and globulin. So this order is very important. So the extent or order of binding of drugs to various plasma proteins are your albumin, which is abundant in our plasma. Next is our alpha 1 acid glycoprotein, the lipoproteins, and globulins. This order is very, very important. Now this table is also very important. So we have the human serum albumin. The molecular weight is around 65,000, and nearly 3.5 to 5 gram percentage is present in your plasma. So where albumin is a base, so all the acidic drugs will, weak acids or weak acid and strong acid drugs will bind to your albumin. Where alpha 1 acid glycoprotein is an acid, so all your basic drugs will bind to your alpha 1 glycoprotein, which is having a molecular weight of 44,000 and a concentration of 0.04 to 1. The next is your lipoproteins. So all your lipophilic drugs, generally all hydrophilic drugs will bind to your serum albumin and glycoprotein, where all the lipophilic drugs will bind to your lipoproteins, which is having a high molecular weight, that is around 2 lakh to 3.4 lakhs. The next are your globulins, which are having different types, that is alpha 1 globulin, alpha 2 globulin. The next is your hemoglobin. So these are the different blood proteins to which the drugs bind. Now, if we look into each other, the first is your human cerebralbumin, having a molecular weight of 65,000. It is the most abundant plasma protein. Remember. So again, to this albumin, we have different binding sites. So generally, albumin having a different binding sites. So we have totally four sites, that is site 1, site 2, and site 3, site 4. And these sites are very important. So let's say for example, this is albumin. Albumin is having different sites where the drugs bind it to different sites. That is site 1, site 2, site 3, and site 4. So all your acidic drugs will bind to your albumin. The site 1 is also called as your warfarin. Site 1 is also called, site 1 is warfarin, also known as azaproposin binding site. These synonyms are also very important. So the examples are also important. Just look into the examples. And site 2 is called diazepam binding site. Site 3 is your digitoxin binding site. And site 4 is your tamoxifen binding site. So remember these binding sites names: site 1, site 2, and site 3, site 4. So these are the four different binding sites of albumin. The next is your alpha 1 acid glycoprotein. So where it is an acid, so all the basic drugs will bind to alpha 1 acid glycoprotein, also known as orosomucoid, which has having a molecular weight of 44,000. So it binds to a number of basic drugs like imipramine, amitriptyline, nortriptyline, propranolol, quinidine, disopyramide. So these are the examples of drugs which bind to alpha 1 acid glycoprotein. So remember the examples also. So next is your lipoproteins. So all your lipophilic drugs will bind to your lipoproteins. So lipoproteins are having highest molecular weight proteins. So again, these lipoproteins are classified into the chylomicrons or VLDL, LDL, HDL. So these are the different categories of lipoproteins, so to which the drugs will bind. So remember the examples also. So a number of acidic, that is diclofenac, neutral cyclosporin A, and the basic drugs like chlorpromazine will bind to your lipoproteins. So these are the some of the examples of drugs which bind to lipoproteins. And next is your the drugs binding to globulins. So this is very important. So generally, we have different types of plasma globulins, that is alpha 1 globulin, alpha 2 globulin, beta 1, beta 2, and gamma globulin. So alpha 1 globulin, also known as transcortin. The name itself, it's a cortin, means corticosteroid, also known as corticosteroid binding globulin. So all your steroidal drugs will bind to your alpha 1 globulin glycoprotein, alpha 1 globulin plasma protein. So like thyroxine, cyanocobalamin, that is B12, vitamin B12. So next is alpha 2 globulin, also known as ceruloplasmin. It binds to vitamin A, D, E, K, and cupric ions. So now coming down the disease where deficiency of copper ions, increase in the concentration of copper ion leads to which disease? Comment down. The next is your beta 1 globulin, also known as transferrin. It will bind to your ferrous ions. So ferrin matlab it's an iron, that is alpha 1 beta 1 globulin beta 1 globulin plasma protein will bind to your all ferrous ions, so also known as transferrin. Next is beta 2 globulin, it will bind to carotenoids. And next is alpha globulin, it will bind to you specifically antisense. So remember these examples and different types of globulins. The next is your binding of drugs to blood cells. So hemoglobin also containing, so your RBC contain some amounts of proteins, plasma protein, that is your hemoglobin and carbonic anhydrase and cell membrane. So hemoglobin also having a molecular weight of 64,500, almost which is equal to your serum albumin. So drugs like phenytoin, phenobarbital, and phenothiazines will bind to your hemoglobin. So remember the examples also. So apart from this, some drugs will bind to your tissue proteins also, like tissue binding of drugs. Mostly, this is the order of tissues of binding of drugs. That is your liver. Mostly all the drugs will bind to your liver, then kidney, then lungs, and then muscles. So this order is also very important. This is the tissue binding of drugs. Order of drugs to bind to which bind to tissues. The next here metallo, metallothionein, a protein present in kidneys, binds to heavy metals. So any heavy metals that is present in your drug, let's say for example, cisplatin is a drug where it contains a platinum, which is a heavy metal. So if you take that drug, that platinum heavy metal will binds to the protein metallothionein, which is present in your kidneys. So likewise, the chloroquine and phenothiazines are accumulate in skin by interacting with your melanin. So your skin contains a protein called melanin, which is responsible for the pigmentation of your skin. So chloroquine and phenothiazines will bind to the melanin protein. And next, we know this commonly the drug is tetracycline, which is a well-known example for drug that binds to your bones and teeth. So it will bind to the bones and teeth. It leads to discoloration of teeth. And next, like all lipophilic drugs such as thiopental and pesticide DDT will accumulate in your adipose tissue. So these are the drugs which will accumulate in your tissue proteins. And some drugs like chloroquine and quinacrine, which will bind to your nucleic acid and leads to distortion of the double helical structure. So these are the different kinds of drugs that will bind to some tissue proteins and leads to their toxicity. So a very important topic for GPAT. So study well. All the best. Thank you. Subscribe to this channel.